Summer 1944. The war in Europe still raged, but thousands of miles away, behind barbed wire under the blinding Texas sun, silence hung over a camp of captured German soldiers. Their uniforms were faded, their boots worn thin. A U.S. Army truck rolled in slowly, its engine humming against the still heat. Prisoners looked up, expecting rations, maybe bread or soup. Instead, they saw something impossible. Men in white aprons carrying metal tubs filled with ice. And inside those tubs, something they hadn't seen in years. Ice cream. Some laughed, thinking it was a cruel joke. Others refused to take it at first, yet as the first spoonfuls melted on their tongues, disbelief turned to quiet astonishment. Their enemy, the Americans, had given them a taste of home. It was not a weapon nor propaganda, just an act of normalcy, almost kindness, amid a world gone mad. And for many of these men, that moment would change everything they thought they knew about their captors and about the war itself. By mid-1944, the tide of war had decisively turned. The Allied invasion of Normandy had breached Hitler's fortress in the west, while Soviet armies crushed German divisions in the east. Every month, tens of thousands of Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe soldiers surrendered, many simply too exhausted, too hungry, and too hopeless to keep fighting. What few realized at the time was that a vast number of these captives would not remain in Europe at all. The United States, separated from the front lines by the Atlantic, agreed to take custody of hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 405,000 POWs were shipped across the ocean, guarded by American sailors, their hands bound but their lives spared. They arrived quietly at ports in Virginia, Louisiana, and New York before being loaded onto trains that disappeared deep into the American interior. These trains didn't carry soldiers to war, they carried the defeated to captivity. The prisoners came from every corner of Hitler's army: Afrika Korps veterans taken in Tunisia, young Volkssturm fighters captured in France, and seasoned officers from Italy and the Western Front. They spoke of the fatherland as though it were an unreachable planet. Many still believed in final victory. Others just wanted to survive. By late 1944, the U.S. Army had built a network of over 500 camps spread across 45 states. Most were in rural areas, quiet fields in Texas, Nebraska, and Georgia, surrounded by little more than wooden fences and watchtowers. For many small American towns, the arrival of hundreds of enemy soldiers felt surreal, like the war itself had arrived at their doorstep. Inside, the camps functioned with an efficiency typical of the U.S. Army. Barracks, mess halls, latrines, even makeshift theaters were built. Each prisoner was issued clothing marked PW, a cot, and a blanket. They were fed according to the Geneva Convention of 1929, which demanded that prisoners of war receive the same standard of food as the troops guarding them. For many Americans, that was a moral obligation. For others, it was a quiet form of psychological warfare, a way to show the world that the United States fought not only with weapons, but with ideals. German soldiers arriving at these camps expected humiliation or starvation. Instead, they found structured routines, medical care, and 3 hot meals a day. Their guards treated them with formality, not hatred. Newspapers were delivered, letters censored, but allowed. Work programs let them earn small wages to buy cigarettes, soap, or writing paper. And in time, something strange began to happen. Suspicion faded. Resentment softened. The lines between enemy and host blurred ever so slightly. To the Germans who had been taught to see Americans as brutal, chaotic, and morally weak, these camps presented a bewildering contradiction. They were captives of an enemy that fed them better than their own army had in months. Some officers whispered that it was a trick, an effort to break their spirit. Others quietly wondered whether they had misunderstood the world outside Germany entirely. By the winter of 1944, the POW system had become an unlikely microcosm of America itself, orderly, abundant, and strangely humane. What the prisoners didn't yet know was that the food they ate, the taste of meat, bread, fruit, and milk would soon lead to something even more unexpected, something that no one in the Wehrmacht training manuals had prepared them for. Because before long, the US Army would introduce one of its simplest pleasures into camp life, a gesture so ordinary to Americans that it hardly seemed worth noting, yet so shocking to the German prisoners that they would write about it for decades afterward. It would come in the form of a dessert, cold, sweet, and utterly foreign to the misery of war. While German soldiers on the Eastern Front faced annihilation, their comrades in American captivity encountered a different reality. One defined by discipline, rules, and a strange kind of mercy. In the Soviet Union, surrender often meant disappearance. Prisoners were marched into labor camps where starvation and disease did the killing. In occupied Europe, British camps were austere but fair, driven by necessity rather than generosity. Yet in the United States, far from the ruined cities of Europe, the approach was deliberate, to treat German prisoners humanely, publicly, and consistently. The American government wanted to send a message to the world and to history that democracy could wage war without losing its soul. That belief had roots in law. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was not just a piece of paper to the US Army, it was a symbol of moral authority. Each camp commander was trained to follow it to the letter. The War Department issued detailed handbooks on POW conduct, outlining food portions, medical care, recreation, and even religious rights. German officers quickly noticed the difference. They were addressed by rank, allowed to organize internal discipline, and encouraged to run classes, choirs, and theatre groups. Some camps built orchestras, others held lectures on engineering, literature, and language. What began as captivity slowly became a strange form of cultural exchange, but there was also strategy behind the kindness. By treating POWs well, the US hoped to encourage similar treatment for its own soldiers held in Germany. Word of American fairness, it was believed, would travel home through letters, filtered though they were by censors, and reach the families of German soldiers still fighting. Those messages might weaken enemy morale more effectively than any bomb. At the same time, the War Department realized that idle men could become dangerous. Keeping prisoners busy meant preventing unrest. So, POWs worked, on farms, in lumber mills, on road repair crews. They earned small wages, learned English, and in many cases met American civilians who would later speak fondly of the Germans who helped harvest cotton or build barns. Yet this humane treatment did not sit easily with everyone. Some American families who had lost sons overseas struggled to understand why enemy soldiers were given comforts their own loved ones lacked. Newspapers occasionally published angry letters. Why do the Nazis get steak while our boys get bullets? Military officials replied with quiet firmness. The United States was not Nazi Germany and would never become it. Still, the contrast was undeniable. In Europe, Allied prisoners recounted beatings, hunger, and neglect. In America, German POWs were shocked to receive meat, vegetables, and milk, even in wartime rationing. One prisoner later wrote, "We thought we would be starved. Instead, we grew fat." The food was not luxurious, but it was plentiful. American rations emphasized calories, protein, and morale. Eggs, coffee, and bread became familiar comforts. On holidays, camps served turkey or roast beef. And in the warmer months, an unexpected luxury began appearing on the menu: ice cream. At first, it was a practical choice. The US Army used refrigeration trucks to preserve milk supplies, and excess dairy was turned into frozen desserts for soldiers. But when the same supply chains reached POW camps, officers decided to extend the treat to prisoners as well, a gesture that no one thought remarkable at the time. To the Germans, though, it was astonishing. They had come from a Europe stripped bare by war, from ration cards, hunger, and scarcity, to find their enemies serving them something cold, sweet, and utterly unnecessary. That moment would become symbolic of the entire American POW experience. It wasn't about food. It was about dignity. The quiet power of a nation confident enough to treat its enemies as human beings. And that realization, the discovery that the enemy could show decency, would soon reshape the hearts and minds of thousands of captured soldiers. Because behind those fences, amid the daily routines of captivity, something was beginning to thaw. For many German soldiers, the moment of capture had been the lowest of their lives. Years of Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as violent, greedy, and morally corrupt. To surrender to them, they believed, meant humiliation, perhaps execution. But when they arrived in American camps, something quietly unexpected happened. No beatings, no cruelty, instead, order. At Camp Swift in Texas, captured infantrymen stood in silence as American cooks ladled food onto their trays: potatoes, meat, coffee. They watched their guards eat from the same pots. The realization came slowly. The enemy didn't hate them. In diaries and letters, some preserved in archives today, German prisoners described their disbelief. One corporal wrote home, "They treat us like soldiers, not animals." Another confessed that it was the first time since 1942 he had eaten a full meal. Human contact reinforced that sense of shock. American guards were mostly young men, many barely out of high school, polite but firm. Some shared cigarettes through the wire or taught English words in exchange for German phrases. In rural towns where POWs worked the fields, farmers brought them cold drinks and occasionally shared lunch under the shade of trees. For the first time in years, many Germans experienced something absent under the Reich: normalcy. And that normalcy carried weight. It dismantled the black and white morality the Nazi regime had instilled. Here, across the ocean, their sworn enemy was not a monster, but a mirror. Ordinary people living free, laughing, building, eating well. In the stillness of captivity, surrounded by American abundance, thousands of German soldiers began asking dangerous questions. What had we been fighting for? What had we believed? The ice cream incident, though small in scale, became a symbol of that revelation. Something as simple as a sweet dessert broke open years of propaganda. It showed that compassion, not coercion, defined this new kind of power. The transformation wasn't instant. Many prisoners held on to pride, refusing to show gratitude. But over months, the atmosphere changed. Songs replaced silence. Camp newspapers began circulating. Even the most hardened officers couldn't deny the decency they witnessed. In an era when war was total, when hatred was policy, this quiet humanity inside American fences felt revolutionary. To the US military, this was not only a moral gesture, it was psychological warfare executed with precision. By the summer of 1944, Washington understood that every German prisoner fed, housed, and treated decently was more than just a captive. He was a potential weapon against the Nazi regime. The War Department's Prisoner of War Division carefully monitored morale reports from every camp. The goal was twofold: prevent resistance and convert the minds of the captives. Officers were instructed to distinguish between hardened Nazis and regular soldiers, offering education and exposure to democratic ideals where possible. This policy, later known as re-education through example, relied less on lectures and more on environment. The camp itself became a classroom. When German prisoners read American newspapers, saw movies, or witnessed guards who obeyed rules rather than ideology, they absorbed a quiet message. Power could coexist with fairness. This approach paid dividends. Escape attempts were rare, violence minimal. Instead of rebellion, many camps saw cooperation. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, prisoners built model aircraft, organized orchestras, and even staged plays from Goethe and Shakespeare, with full approval of their guards. To outside observers, this leniency seemed naive, but US strategists knew the long game. When the war ended, these men would return to Germany as witnesses. Their stories could help undermine Nazism from within. And indeed, many would later tell their families that the United States, for all its might, had fought differently, not with hatred, but with conviction. Even the ice cream, trivial as it seemed, fit this design. A country capable of serving dessert to its enemies projected an image of boundless confidence. It showed that America, unlike the Third Reich, did not need cruelty to assert dominance. By treating POWs with dignity, the US demonstrated to both allies and adversaries that democracy was not weakness. It was strength refined. The gesture of handing a German prisoner a spoonful of ice cream became unknowingly a piece of soft power in its purest form. It said, "We can destroy you in battle and still feed you afterward, because our values are stronger than your hate." And while it may not have been written in any military manual, it proved to be one of the most successful psychological operations of the war, achieved not through propaganda leaflets, but through the simple taste of humanity. As the days in captivity stretched into months, those lessons began to sink deep. The ice cream was remembered not because it was sweet, but because it was merciful. And yet, that mercy carried complexities, moments of cultural friction, internal conflict, and moral debate, both among guards and prisoners alike. The POW camps of America became, in many ways, small laboratories of cultural exchange. Behind barbed wire, under flags of two nations, a quiet fusion of worlds began to take shape. German soldiers, once raised under a totalitarian state that glorified discipline and fear, now found themselves surrounded by the rhythms of American life. They heard country music drifting from guard radios. They saw young American soldiers reading comic books, drinking Coca-Cola, and speaking freely about their leaders without fear of punishment. It was disorienting. Germany's speech had been dangerous. In America, it was casual. In time, camp life reflected this contrast. Prisoners who once saluted with rigid precision now laughed, sang, and debated philosophy in their barracks. They painted murals, carved wooden toys, and formed orchestras that played both Beethoven and jazz. The camp bands performed on weekends. Sometimes American guards listened from outside the wire, clapping politely at the end of a song. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi, a group of German engineers even helped design local flood control models for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, real work that would later be implemented after the war. But the most powerful cultural exchange came through something simpler: food. German prisoners often marveled at American abundance. Even during rationing, the United States remained a land of variety: bread, butter, milk, fruit, and of course, ice cream. The frozen dessert appeared regularly in summer, distributed from mess halls or mobile freezers. Some prisoners wrote that they couldn't comprehend how a nation could afford to give ice cream to its enemies while fighting a global war. One recalled in his memoir, "We thought it was propaganda. We couldn't believe they would waste resources on us. But then we realized, to them, this was normal." That realization hit harder than any military defeat. For these men, raised in a system that equated cruelty with strength, American casual kindness was an ideological earthquake. The ice cream wasn't luxury, it was culture. It symbolized a society so confident in its prosperity that it extended comfort even to those who had tried to destroy it. As months passed, the camps became unexpected windows into American democracy, flawed, imperfect, but free. The prisoners studied its language, absorbed its music, and quietly began to envy its spirit. By the time the war neared its end, many would admit something remarkable. They had come to respect the enemy more than the government they had once served. But beneath the surface of kindness, moral tensions simmered. Not everyone in America agreed with such generosity. Letters poured into newspapers, questioning why German soldiers, men who had fought for Hitler, were being given good food, books, and leisure, while American soldiers starved in German camps. For some guards, the moral line blurred. They had lost friends in Normandy and the Ardennes. Treating German POWs humanely often felt like betrayal. Yet the military insisted discipline and humanity were inseparable. The United States would not mirror the barbarity it fought against. In many camps, guards found their anger slowly replaced by curiosity. They discovered that the men behind the swastika were not all ideologues. Many were farmers, clerks, teachers. Some had been drafted as teenagers. Conversations through the wire turned enemies into human beings. Prisoners too faced moral reckoning. They had entered captivity, believing in the righteousness of the Reich. But every decent act from an American guard chipped away at that illusion. When a US medic treated a wounded German without hesitation, or when ice cream was served on the 4th of July alongside music and laughter, the moral contrast was undeniable. What did it mean when the enemy behaved with more honor than their own leaders? Some prisoners tried to cling to Nazi pride, dismissing it as American manipulation. But others couldn't ignore the evidence before them. They began holding quiet discussions about politics, guilt, and truth, subjects that had been forbidden in Germany. In 1945, a secret US program called Special Projects Division expanded these ideas through camp newspapers and discussion groups, promoting democratic values. But in truth, the most powerful lessons had already been delivered, not through lectures, but through lived experience. When a man is offered kindness in captivity, it reshapes his understanding of strength. By the war's end, thousands of German POWs had undergone a quiet moral transformation. They had seen a different kind of power, not born from ideology or fear, but from empathy. The United States had not merely defeated an army, it had conquered a worldview. And soon, as 1945 dawned and the camps prepared for mass repatriations, those lessons would face their greatest test. When the prisoners who had tasted American freedom returned to a broken homeland, still haunted by dictatorship. It was July 4th, 1945, Independence Day. Across the United States, towns celebrated victory in Europe. Fireworks crackled above courthouse lawns, bands played marches, and flags waved from porches still painted with gold stars for sons who would never return. Inside a fenced compound in Camp Hearn, Texas, another celebration unfolded, smaller, quieter, but no less symbolic. The German prisoners had noticed the preparations days before: extra food deliveries, new flags hung near the mess hall, and guards working with a lighter mood. Then, around noon, the announcement came. Lunch would include something special: roast beef, fruit, and, to their astonishment, ice cream. For most of the Germans, it had been years since they had seen or tasted it. The war in Europe had frozen luxury out of existence. Even officers had forgotten the texture of cold sweetness on the tongue. And now here they were, defeated, imprisoned, wearing uniforms marked PW, being served bowls of ice cream by their captors. At first, many refused to believe it was real. Some stared in disbelief at the metal trays as guards handed out scoops. Others tasted cautiously, expecting irony, perhaps mockery. But none came. The Americans simply smiled, joked among themselves, and went on serving. In one camp diary, a former Luftwaffe pilot described the moment. "I remember the first spoonful as if it were yesterday. Cold, sweet, a luxury of peace. I thought of my wife, my mother of Germany. I did not think of Hitler." The symbolism was undeniable. The ice cream wasn't about dessert, it was about humanity. For men who had been taught to despise weakness, this act of generosity shattered indoctrination more effectively than any propaganda leaflet. The guards, too, felt the weight of the moment. Many were young Americans, barely 20, who had fought on beaches or in bombers. They had seen death, but here they were feeding the very soldiers who had once tried to kill them. Some found the act healing, others found it strange, but all of them understood it was necessary. The camp that day filled with an unusual sound. Laughter. Not mocking laughter, but genuine, uneasy laughter born from disbelief. Prisoners clinked spoons against metal bowls, trading memories of home and wondering aloud how a nation could afford such kindness. In that fleeting afternoon, the ideological war cracked. Letters written afterward tell the story best. One soldier wrote home, "Today our guards celebrated their national holiday. They gave us ice cream. Imagine that. The enemy shares his joy with us. It is something I will never forget." Another added, "They are either mad or they are truly free men." Freedom. That was the word that kept reappearing. In captivity, the Germans had witnessed a kind of liberty they had never known in their own homeland. Here, guards and prisoners lived by rules, not fear. Discipline existed, but without cruelty. Order without terror. Even the celebrations themselves spoke volumes. Americans cheered their independence by sharing it, not flaunting it. They celebrated victory without vengeance, and that, for many of the prisoners, was the turning point. The war had told them that democracy was chaos, that freedom led to weakness. Yet the reality inside those barbed fences showed the opposite. A nation powerful enough to defeat them, yet kind enough to feed them dessert. It was, in its own way, a quiet revolution. That summer, camp life began to change. Prisoners volunteered for extra work, joined language classes, and took part in debates about rebuilding Germany. Some even began writing articles for internal newspapers about democracy and responsibility. The transformation wasn't orchestrated by military orders or propaganda. It came from experience. From ice cream on a hot day, from a smile through a fence, from the realization that the world they had been taught to hate was built on values they secretly admired. The ice cream melted quickly in the heat that day, but its memory did not. For many, it marked the precise moment when they stopped being soldiers of a defeated empire and started becoming witnesses to a different kind of power, one defined not by conquest but by conscience. By 1946, the last of the German POWs in the United States were beginning their journey home. For many, it was a reluctant return. They were going back to a homeland shattered by bombs, divided by occupation zones, and haunted by hunger. The America they left behind had treated them better than many expected, and for some, far better than their own government ever had. The US had made a deliberate decision to use humanity as a weapon of rehabilitation. The POW education program aimed to reintroduce German prisoners to democratic ideals, truth, and accountability. Camps screened Nazi propaganda films beside reels of American documentaries, films showing democratic debates, industrial cooperation, and civic freedom. The same men who once swore loyalty to Hitler now watched images of American elections and workers' unions. Food was a silent ambassador throughout this psychological campaign. The abundance of American meals, meatloaf, coffee, milk, and yes, ice cream, stood in stark contrast to the starvation and rationing they knew back home. The sweet, cold dessert that had astonished them in captivity now became a symbol of something greater, a society that valued comfort over cruelty, generosity over fear. Letters sent by German POWs back to their families, many of which still survive in archives, describe the surreal contrast. "They treat us fairly, we eat well, we even had ice cream," wrote one prisoner from Camp Swift, Texas, in early 1945. For his mother in bombed-out Dresden, the image of her captured son eating ice cream was almost incomprehensible. When these men finally disembarked in ruined ports like Bremerhaven, their perception of America had changed. Some felt guilt. How could the enemy have shown such decency? Others felt a quiet respect, even admiration. A significant number of them later returned voluntarily, immigrating to the United States during the 1950s under new resettlement laws. They became farmers in Iowa, machinists in Michigan, and teachers in Wisconsin, carrying memories of barbed wire, boredom, and a curious treat that melted under the southern sun. Historians now view the American POW policy as one of the most successful rehabilitation efforts of the war. While Soviet and British camps struggled with riots, starvation, and hatred, US camps produced something unexpected: men who no longer wanted to fight. For some of those former prisoners, the memory of that ice cream machine in the mess hall became a lifelong symbol of a turning point, not of surrender, but of awakening, a reminder that even in captivity, the human spirit could be reached through kindness. The legacy of those camps lingered quietly through decades of peace. German veterans who once shoveled snow in Texas or picked fruit in Georgia would tell their children about the strange, gentle enemy who served them ice cream during war. For many of their families, that story became a small, almost unbelievable thread connecting two worlds, one shattered by ideology, the other sustained by humanity. And so, when the barbed wire fences finally came down, what remained was not bitterness, but memory. A memory of a war that could have been darker still, if not for moments of unexpected light. In the grand scale of World War II, the battles, the bombings, the shifting empires, the story of German prisoners eating ice cream in American camps seems almost trivial. Yet, in its smallness lies its meaning. It reminds us that even in humanity's darkest chapter, there were moments when compassion refused to surrender. The American treatment of German POWs was not born solely of mercy, it was also strategy. The US understood that how it handled its prisoners would echo far beyond the war. Every fair meal, every medical check, every cold scoop of ice cream was a demonstration of strength without cruelty. It said to the world, "We fight fiercely, but we do not abandon our humanity." For the German soldiers, this realization often arrived slowly, quietly, between shifts of camp labor or during long evenings staring across the fences. The same men who once fought for a regime built on hatred found themselves treated with a dignity they'd never known from their own leaders. The shock of that contrast left an imprint deeper than any propaganda could erase. Many historians today point to these experiences as seeds of post-war transformation. When Germany rose again, not as a military power but as a democracy, it was shaped in part by those who had glimpsed another way of life while in American hands. Some even credited their time in captivity as the moment they began to question everything they once believed. And that is why the story of ice cream in the camps endures. It isn't about comfort, it's about conviction. About how a nation chose to uphold its values even toward its enemies. About how sometimes the simplest acts, a meal shared, a kindness shown, can change the course of a man's heart, and through him, the course of summer 1944. The war in Europe still raged, but thousands of miles away, behind barbed wire under the blinding Texas sun, silence hung over a camp of captured German soldiers. Their uniforms were faded, their boots worn thin. A US Army truck rolled in slowly, its engine humming against the